Hi everyone. So in this video we are going to get started learning how to make procedural materials in Blender. So to get started, I've opened a new file here and I have just a default cube. What I'm going to do is we're going to start by making some wood, which is a pretty basic material and pretty straightforward to make. But we're going to make sort of a close to photorealistic looking wood in as simple a way as I can. And obviously there are more complex ones. So I'm going to hit, let me turn on screencast keys. GZ1 and scale it in the x-axis and scale it in the y-axis down a bit until we've got like a plank. And we're just going to make a wooden plank here. Now over here on the right, if you go to the material properties, it already has a material by default. If for some reason it doesn't, you can always just click new, add a new material into the first slot, and we're going to call our material wood. Then in the shading tab, let's get started looking at how to work with procedural materials. Now before we do that, we need to enable an add-on in case you haven't enabled it already. If you go into Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, I'm going to search for Node Wrangler, which you don't have to install. It comes with Blender. You just need to make sure that it's ticked on in order to use it. And what that does is it essentially allows us to preview what's coming out of a node in the shader graph, and so that's really useful. So for example, here on this object, if we had like a red material and a blue material, I can actually preview what's coming out of this red material or this red principled BSDF here by hitting Control, Shift, and then clicking on the node. And unfortunately, screencast keys doesn't work in this window, but I'm just pressing, holding down Control, Shift, and click, and you can see that it moves the output, the material output for the surface of the object to whatever you have Control, Shift, and clicked. And in that way, when you're working with complex materials, if you want to know what a particular node, or if you've worked with Photoshop, you can sort of think of it sort of in terms of layers. If you want to know what that specific one is doing, you can hit Control Shift click and it will automatically show you the output just for that node. And then to sort of reset it back to how it was, just Control Shift and click again on the principled BSDF that you want to be your output. Now the first thing we're going to learn about are sort of color outputs and factors and mixed nodes. So if you hit Shift A, you'll get this input window, and we're going to look for I'm just going to hit search, and we're going to look for mix. And the first one, it's just called mix. We're going to bring that in. And then it has this drop down menu that says float. It has float, vector, and color. We're going to change this to color because we want to mix color data. Now back in the day, if you're using an older version of Blender, and I mentioned this in a previous video, this drop down for color was actually its own individual node called Mix RGB. And so if you're using like Blender 3.2 or earlier, then you'll want to look for Mix RGB instead of just the Mix node. So what does this node do? Well, I'm going to hit Control Shift and click so that we can preview its output. And you can see here that it's got sort of a couple of options, right? So the first one is A, which is a color input. The second one is B, which is also a color input, and then we have this factor. And what the factor is it's a single input. It goes from 0 to 1, and it essentially determines how much we're going to blend between A and B. And A and B can be, textures. So if, for example, you brought in like a texture sample like we've done in previous videos, you could plug its color output into A or B and then blend between the two of them using this factor. And if you have a black and white texture map sort of mapped onto the surface of your object, you could even plug that into the factor and use that to blend between the two. So I'll just show you this now. If I turn A to red and B to blue, if you mix red and blue, you get purple. So with a factor of 0.5, we have a purple output. And if I drag it all the way up to 1, it'll be completely blue. If I drag it all the way down, it'll be completely red. I'm going to set that back to 0.5. The next node that we're going to look at is the noise node. So if you hit Shift A and you go under texture, you can see this is where all the procedural textures live, and we have a lot of them. You can explore them on your own. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. We have like Musgrave, Voronoi, Wave. These are all very useful textures that if you're doing a lot of procedural texturing, you'll use quite often. But for now, I'm just going to add a noise texture. So Shift A, texture, noise texture. And I want to show you the difference between a color and a factor input. So if I plug this color into our principled BSDF, I'm going to Control-Shift-Click so that we're previewing the output of the principled BSDF. You can see that we have noise, but it's color noise. And the reason for that is color outputs have 3 channels. So we have R, red, G, green, and B for blue. So a color output will always have RGB. And you can actually break those apart if you wanted to. So if I drag off of this color and I search for separate color, oops, not XYZ, we want to do separate color, then if I plug this red channel into the principled BSDF, you can see this is what's coming out of the red channel of that noise texture. So this is only the red noise. And the reason that it looks black and white is because we are just plugging the data from a single channel into this color output. So if we wanted to preview it in red, what we could do is we could add another node called combine color. Here we go. And if we plug that into the base color, you can see now this is what's coming out of the red channels. Anything that it was white is going to be completely red, and anything that was black on this separate color is going to be completely not red. And the same is true for green and blue. If I preview the combined color here, you can see this is what this looks like. If I unplug the green channel, then we're going to have no green whatsoever. Now the factor is essentially a single channel. So it could be, you could use it as any data that you wanted, but it doesn't have RGB. It just has one channel that goes from 0 to 1. And so if I plug this into the base color and preview it, you'll see this looks essentially like the same thing, but it's black and white. And that's because it just has one channel. So you can think of the factor as being a black and white map and the color as being a color map, sort of the same thing. But the technical difference between the two is that the color has 3 channels and the factor has 1. And you'll notice on our mix node, we have an input for factor here. And so if I Control-Shift-Click on the mix node to preview it, remember we have this factor here where it goes from 0 being completely red and 1 being completely blue. Well, you can actually blend those all over the surface of your object according to a factor per pixel, so that your object doesn't have the same constant blend all over the place. So for example, like if I Control-Shift-Click this noise texture here, if I plug this into the factor, everything that's white is going to be 100% blue, everything that's black is going to be 100% red, and then anything that's sort of gray in between those two is going to be sort of some shade of purple. So it'll be between red and blue. And so if I go ahead and drag off this factor and plug it into the mix node, and then I Control-Shift-Click the mix node so we preview its output, you can see that that's what's happening, right? So the white areas got blue, the black areas got red, and sort of a lot of this that was gray is sort of in between. So we have a mix between red and blue, and so a lot of the surface is purple. But you can see now we have this cool mix of colors on the surface of our object. So let's use this to get started making something that looks like real wood. And so I've pulled up a reference image here, and we're going to make something that's maybe not exactly like this, but a little bit like this. And so I'm going to pick some colors for a noise mixture that are sort of the same colors as this. So we have like a mottled sort of brown beigey color here. So to do that, I'm just going to Control-Shift-Click, make sure that we're previewing the output of this mix node. And then here where it says A, I'm going to change that to a hex value. And the color I ended up settling on for this was 906335. And if you type that in and hit enter, you can see it's this sort of like darkish brown sort of color. And then for the B color channel, I'm going to put in a hex code of CA995F and hit enter. And you can see now we've got a mixture between sort of a darker brown and a lighter sort of beigey color. Now that's pretty good. I do think that it looks a little bit stretched though. I would like it to be sort of a different scale and maybe a little bit more uniform. So what I can do is if you click, and I'm just clicking on this noise texture here, and this is another feature of the node wrangler that we enabled, is if you hit Control T, it will add a texture coordinate node and a mapping node, and it will plug them in automatically to this. And that's really useful because we can change some of the features on this mapping node to affect the appearance of that texture. So for example, if I change the Y rotation here, you can see that it's rotating, right? So let's reset that to 0. And if I change the Z, you can see it's getting larger and smaller. And so what I want to do is I want to set the Z to a value of like, I don't know, 3 or 4, something that looks pretty uniform. And then I also want the pattern of this to be a little bit larger. You could do that on the mapping node, but there are 3 scale inputs, and so it will be easier to just do it on the noise texture because it also has a scale value here. So I'm going to change the scale to something like, oops, not 10, maybe like 3, something like that. And now you can see we've got this sort of modeled texture, which is a good base for something like wood. All right, so I'm going to plug the result of this final mix node into our principled BSDF, and Control Shift click the principled BSDF to again set everything back to where it was. And this is a good starting point for wood. I'm noticing my scene is a bit dark, by the way. You can add a light. You can just add a light to your scene, or there's already maybe a point light here, and just drag it around. I'm actually going to add an HDRI, which I do quite often because it gives much better lighting to the scene. And again, we covered this in a previous video, but you do that by going to the shading tab and going to the world tab and just replace or just add a texture environment texture and plug it into the background, and then choose an HDRI file. So that'll be a .hdr or a .exr, and you can download those from a couple of places online. There's Polyhaven has some free ones, so you can Google that if you need some. So I'll choose a file and open it, and that will add some good lighting to our scene. There we go. So you can see already we've got something that looks a little bit like wood. I want to go more for that look here though, where we've got like the rings of the tree in the wood, and obviously our wood currently doesn't have that. So let's go ahead and work on that. So back in the shading tab, I'm going to click again, go back from world to our current object, and I'm just going to grab these nodes and move them down because we need one more thing. And so essentially we need to mix this base color with those rings. So how can we do that? Well, we know that we're going to need another mix node, right, to mix between the rings and our base color. So I'll duplicate this and just put this here. And we need to pick a color for our rings. That's going to go into this B slot here. And I'm just going to make it a bit darker like that. So I'm just dragging this brightness down to make sort of a darker brown as the rings. And then we can plug in our base color into the A slot. And if we Control Shift click this mix node, you can see that now we're mixing between that completely brown, dark brown color and our base color. But obviously we only want to add that dark brown color where the rings should appear. So let's make that pattern as a black and white map so that we can plug it into this factor. So a good way to do this is with the wave texture. So I'm going to hit Shift A, texture wave, and let's Control Shift click the wave texture so that we can just look at it on its own and get an understanding of what it does. So the wave texture creates these bands, and this again is coming out of the color output, but this is a black and white map in all 3 channels. And it has a couple of different modes that look a little bit different. You can change it from sine to saw, and we'll get sort of a different look like this, or from saw to triangle, and we'll get sort of a sharper looking wave here. The other thing that we can do, which we're going to do for this one, is we're going to change it from bands to rings. And you'll notice when we do that, it doesn't look like anything has really happened. And it has, it's just we're not seeing it. And if you look around the object, you might notice that we do actually have rings here on the side. They're just stretched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this wave texture and again hit Control T to add a texture coordinate node, and I'm going to plug the UV into this vector slot instead of generated, so that it's going to use the UV map of this object. And you can see that changes the appearance. And we did a little bit of UV mapping before. We're going to have a more in-depth video on UV mapping again, but essentially now if I tab into edit mode and A to select all, and then I go into the UV editing window, you can see we have the UV map for this object here. And so now if I click on this object here and I go here, you can see under this wave texture, we have another drop-down menu for the direction. And it currently says, if you hover here, it says rings along x-axis. And we want to change that because we want the rings to go along the z-axis. So we can go to this drop-down and change it to z. And you can see now we have rings going vertically. You could also change it to spherical as well, but I'm going to leave this on z. And so now I'm just going to turn up the scale because I think that these rings are gigantic, maybe to something like 15, and I'm doing that on the wave texture node. And over here on the mapping node, we can also just shift the position of this procedural texture using this location input. So if I want to move it in the x-axis, I can move it like that. And also if I wanted to stretch it in a particular axis, maybe stretch it this way, maybe change, so to turn the Y down to 0.5, and I'll turn the scale and the wave texture up to 30. You know, it takes some playing around with it. I'm just gonna change this to something maybe more like this, and I just want to drag this over, oops, until we get something like this, where the rings are not completely straight. There we go. Something like this is fine. Now this is cool, but it's very neat and tidy, and obviously wood is more messy than this. So if you click on this wave texture, you can turn up the amount of detail and the amount of distortion. So I'm going to turn up distortion and I'm going to turn up detail, and you can see we get more of a rough look to this. And I'm also going to change it from sine to saw, and I'm going to turn my my detail up something like this, so we've got that really like rough appearance here. So I ended up here with a value of like 0.25 on the x on this mapping node, and for scale I have 1.95 in y and 1 on z, and then for the wave texture I have 30, 7.2 for distortion, 15, 1, 1, and phase offset doesn't matter in this case. So that's cool. So now what we want to do is we want to blend that using the mix node so that we have our modeled base color that we created before as the base, and then the dark of those rings only here where it's black. And so we're using the color output or the factor output of this wave texture that we created to drive that blend. So I'm going to take this wave texture here and I'm going to plug it, I'm going to drag its factor, oops, and plug it into this second mix node that we created. So we have the factor of our wave texture going into the factor of the mix node. We have our base color that we created, the sort of modeled one, as A, and then we have the dark sort of rings color here that we created here as B. And now if I Control-Shift-Click on this mix, you'll see that we've got something that looks a lot more like wood, where we've got that sort of modeled background color, and then we also have the rings. All right, so now this looks pretty flat, and that's because we are still only previewing the base color. So let's Control-Shift-Click on our principled BSDF to go back to previewing sort of the material shader output as a whole, and just make sure that our result here is plugged into the base color. And so now if we go back here into the viewport, you can see we've got a pretty acceptable looking wood. All right, so we've got our wood, we've got our mask for our rings, we've got our sort of modelly wood colored base color, and then we've got this dark color for the ring, and we are blending between our modeled color and this dark brown based on that factor. So that's essentially a general introduction to how you would set up a very basic procedural material. Now this is cool, but it's flat, and so we're going to add a little bit of depth to it by making a bump map. And what is a bump map? Essentially, it's a way to add detail to the shading of an object to fake the appearance of depth. And you may also hear the term normal map. The difference between a normal map and a bump map is that a normal map uses a 3-vector, so it will have 3 channels, similar to the color output of an image texture, which is why image textures are used as normal maps. But a bump map only has 1 channel, so you can think of a bump map as being like this factor. It's got a single channel that describes its height, and then the shader will use that information to sort of fake sort of the shading on the surface. And it's a little bit less precise than a normal map because it only has 1 channel, but it's very easy to do procedurally. So we're going to add a bump map to this by going Shift-A, and we're going to search for bump. And you can see here, the bump map has a couple of things. We've got an input for height, and that's going to be the height is going to be the factor that we plug in to sort of describe on the surface of our object. Where do we want to be raised and where do we want to be depressed? And then the output of this is going to go into the normal input on our principled BSDF shader. So we can go ahead and plug that in. So take this input from the normal and connect it to the normal here. And now we need something to plug into the bump map. Now conveniently, we've already created a mask for which areas might be raised and which areas might be depressed. And that's the difference between sort of the lighter colored parts of the mesh and the darker area where the rings are. And that is this wave texture here that we created earlier. So if I again Control-Shift-Click on this wave, you can see we've got a factor output that already describes sort of light and dark areas where we might want to have some shading accent the fact that something is raised or lowered. And so all we need to do is take this factor and plug it into the height of our bump map. And if I Control-Shift-Click to go back to our principled BSDF, I can show you what this does. So if I set this strength on this bump node down to 0, you can see that this object looks very, very flat, right? And that's because it's essentially like a rectangular prism. It has no additional geometry. But we can fake some shading on this using that height in order to give the illusion of depth. And so if I turn the strength back up to 1, you can see now on the side of this, it looks like light is sort of reflecting in and out of those areas where we have some of those lines. And so that's one way that you can essentially fake depth in your meshes without adding any additional geometry, is through using a bump map. And if I unplug this base color, I just want to show you that. So now we have no base color plugged into the principled BSDF, and you can see we still have that appearance here, right? And that's because this is affecting the shading of the model. So essentially, if you're all of the pixels on your monitor, it is sort of perturbing the interpolated normals so that you can have sort of an illusion of depth by brightening and darkening sections of the mesh according to that bump map that we've got plugged in. So this isn't affecting the color, the base color of the mesh at all. It is purely affecting how the object is shaded. I'm going to go ahead and plug our base color back in, and now you can see we've got our wood. And I also want to change the roughness of this. You could leave this like this. I think it looks okay. It's pretty basic, but it sort of gets the job done depending what you're trying to make. However, if you wanted to use this for like a floorboard or something, you might actually want to have that be like to have a finish on the outside, right? And so to do that, we can just turn the roughness down to like 0.2 or 0.1, and now you can see that we've got some reflection on the side of our wood. And you could totally use this to make a bunch of floorboards if you wanted to. You could go in, for example, and add maybe an array modifier and set the factor to like 1.02 0.025, something like that, or maybe less than that, like 1.01, so that there's very minimal space between them, and maybe make, you know, a whole bunch of these. And now you've got, you know, a bunch of wood panels. One other thing I would do if you were going to make a wood panel like this is just to bevel the edges, and you can do that by adding a bevel modifier. And I'm going to put that in the stack underneath the array modifier. You could also put it above. It doesn't really matter in this case. Sometimes it does matter, the order of operations. But I'm just going to select our object and Control A to apply a rotation and scale, and then set the amount to something really small, like let's see, 0.01. And now, as just a final touch, all of our boards are currently exactly the same, which obviously, you know, is probably not right for floorboards or something like that. And so I'm just going to apply this array modifier here, and tab into edit mode, and A to select all. And if you remember in the shading tab earlier, I got you to plug the UV here into the mapping node instead of the generated output. And that's because we want this texture mapped across the UV map of the object. That way we can actually change it for each board so that they're not all identical. So if I, for example, here, I'm in the UV editing tab, I'm going to select one vert on one of these, and if you hit Control L, it will select all that are linked. And if I just move the UV a little bit, if I move it a little bit to the left, or I maybe rotate it, you can see that now, right, we've got a situation where we have a board that's different than the other ones. And so in this way, you can generate a whole bunch of different wooden planks, and you can also change them so that they're not all exactly the same. So I'm just going to render this out, and of course it's good to practice this. So N, and we'll turn on camera to view, 0 to go into the camera mode, and just sort of position it where we would like to render. And then I'm going to hit F12 to render this out. So there you go. Now in the next video, we're going to talk more about different types of procedural textures, because there are a lot of different nodes in Blender's procedural material generation system. And so we're going to learn about some new nodes, and we're going to spend some time talking about how to use them.